My grandfather forgot my name on a Tuesday, and I did not cry until I was alone in the car park afterward, because he had taught me long ago that a man does not weep in front of the people he loves if he can help it carry their day instead. He called me young man that morning. He said it kindly, the way he would have said it to a stranger who had done him a small courtesy, and he offered me the chair across from his as though the room were his and I were the guest. It was his room. I had carried in the photographs myself, 4 months earlier, when we moved him to the care home with the long windows and the garden nobody used in winter. He did not know the photographs. He looked at the one of my grandmother and asked who the pretty woman was, and I told him, and he nodded the way a polite man nods at a fact he has no use for, and then he asked again 10 minutes later. I am his grandson. My name is Aldous Crane, and I had spent 31 years believing my grandfather was the most permanent thing in the world. He had been a soldier once, not the kind that gets written about, he never let anyone write about him, but the kind that stands. That was the word he used. Not fought, not served, stood. I stood my post, he would say, and that was the whole of it, and somehow it was enough to make a boy sit up straighter at the dinner table without being told. So I did not know what to do with a man who could not stand up from his chair without forgetting, halfway, why he had risen. The doctors had a word for it, and the word was gentle and clinical and useless to me. What I understood was simpler and worse. My grandfather was leaving while his body stayed. Some mornings he was almost whole, sharp, even, quick with a joke about the porridge. And some mornings he was a stranger wearing his face, looking out from behind it as if from the window of a train that had begun, very slowly, to pull away from a platform where I was still standing. The home was a decent place. I want to say that plainly because it matters. The staff were kind. There was a woman named Sister Pell who ran the day room and called every man in it captain, regardless of rank, and she had a way of touching an old shoulder that made the touch land like respect rather than pity. But a decent place is still a place you are kept, and my grandfather knew it the way an animal knows a fence even when it cannot see the wire. He kept trying to leave, not to escape. He had nowhere he was trying to reach, no plan, no destination he could have named. He simply rose sometimes and walked to the door and stood at it with his hand on the frame, waiting. When the staff asked him gently what he needed, he would frown, and the frown was the worst thing of all, because behind it I could see him searching for something he was certain he had once known and could no longer find. "I have somewhere to be," he would say. "Where, Captain?" Sister Pell would ask. And he would look at her, and his mouth would open, and nothing would come, and his hand would tighten on the door frame, and then he would let the staff lead him back to his chair, and he would sit down like a man surrendering a city. That was the thing the word the doctors gave me did not contain. It was not the forgetting that broke me. It was watching a man who had given his whole life to duty lose the one thing he had been most sure of, his post. Wherever he was trying to go, some part of him still believed he was needed there, still believed he had a place to stand, and the world kept gently sitting him back down. I visited every Tuesday and Saturday. I held a job I will not bore you with, and I had a small flat across the city, and I had, until recently, a habit of believing I was busy. The home cured me of that. You learn, sitting beside a man who does not know your name, exactly how much of your life is noise. It was Sister Pell who first said the word that changed everything. I had been complaining, in the soft way you complain to someone who has heard worse 1,000 times, that I could not reach him any more, that the photographs did nothing, that the names did nothing. That I would say, "Grandfather, it's Aldous," and he would smile at me as at a salesman. "It's not the names that stay," she said. She was folding a blanket as she said it, not looking at me, which is how she said all her truest things. "It's the bones underneath them. The body remembers what the mind lets go. Music sometimes, prayers, the shape of a thing a man did 10,000 times before he ever had to think about it." "He did everything 10,000 times," I said. "He was a soldier." She stopped folding the blanket then, and she did look at me. Was he, she said. It was not a question. Some of them, when the words go, the standing stays the longest. It's the deepest thing they ever learned. You might be surprised what's still in there, young man, if the right thing knocked. I did not understand her yet. I would. The idea, when it came to me, came the way most real ideas come, too late to be clever, and obvious in hindsight. My grandfather had a birthday coming, his 89th, and for as long as I had been alive, the one outing he had never refused, the one place he would put on his good coat for without complaint, was the changing of the guard at the old royal forecourt in the heart of the city. It is a ceremony I had watched dozens of times as a boy, my hand swallowed in his, my chin tipped back to take it all in. The guardsmen in their tall dark bearskins and red tunics, white gloves bright as bone, the slow precise machinery of their drill, the way a whole crowd of restless people would fall quiet, almost without noticing, when the formation stepped off. My grandfather never spoke during it. He stood with his hat in his hands and his back very straight, and once, I was perhaps 9, I had looked up and seen tears standing in his eyes, unfallen, and I had not understood and had known better than to ask. That's the post, he'd told me once when I was older. Those lads, they stand it so the rest of us can sleep. People think it's pageantry. He'd shaken his head slowly. It's a promise, made in public so it can't be taken back. I had not understood that either. I think I am beginning to now. So I decided, for his 89th birthday I would take him back, not to a photograph of the thing, to the thing itself. I would wheel him out into the cold, bright morning and put him in front of the men who still stood the post he could no longer remember he had once stood himself, and I would let whatever was left of him meet whatever was still true out there. Sister Pell had said the right thing knocking. I did not know what would knock. But I knew of nothing on this earth that had ever stood straighter in my grandfather's regard than those silent men at their gate. I told the home. I told the doctor, who frowned and used careful words about overstimulation and disorientation, and then, when I did not back down, softened and said it might do more good than harm, and that I should bring a folding chair in case the standing tired him. I did not tell him that I was almost certain my grandfather would not stand at all, that he would sit in his wheelchair in his good coat, a courteous stranger at a spectacle, and that I was bringing him not because I believed it would wake him, but because I could not bear the thought that he would die having forgotten the one place that had ever made him weep with something other than confusion. I want to be honest about that. I did not go expecting a miracle. I went the way you go to lay flowers, to honor a thing that is already mostly gone. The night before I pressed his good coat myself. I found in the home's small closet the box of his that I had never opened, because opening it had felt like reading a letter meant for someone else. That night I opened it. Inside, wrapped in tissue gone soft as cloth, were his medals. I am not going to pretend I knew what they all were. I knew enough. There was weight in them, the particular density of small, heavy, honest things, and there was a ribbon I recognized from a single grim conversation he had let slip once and never repeated. I sat on the floor of my flat with them in my lap for a long time. Then I did something I could not entirely explain to myself. I took them to a man who mounts such things, and I had them cleaned and properly mounted on a bar, the way they should be worn, and I paid more than I should have to have it done by the morning. Because if my grandfather was going to sit in front of those men as a stranger, I was at least going to send him in dressed as what he was. I did not know, carrying that small heavy bar of ribbon and metal out of the shop the next dawn, that it would change everything. I thought it was a gesture for me, a thing to make the visit bearable. I was wrong about almost all of it, but I was not wrong to bring them. God knows I was not wrong about that. The morning of his birthday came up cold and clean, the kind of late autumn light that makes the breath show and the stone of the old forecourt go the color of pale honey. I arrived at the home before 8. He was already dressed, which surprised me, until Sister Pell told me she had told him the night before that his grandson was taking him somewhere special, and that he had been up since 6, sitting in his coat by the window, waiting. He doesn't remember what for, she said, but the body knew there was somewhere to be. He's been good all morning, patient. She gave me a look I did not have a word for. Whatever you're doing, young man, the deep part of him is already half out the door for it. When I came into his room, he looked at me, and for a moment, one whole bright moment, I thought I saw him. The real him surfacing, the way a face surfaces in dark water. Then it passed, and he was courteous and far away again, but he let me pin the metal bar to his coat without asking what it was. He looked down at it once, at the small ribbons against the dark wool, and his hand came up and rested over them, flat, the way a man's hand rests over something he is protecting. He did not say anything, but he did not let go of them the whole way down in the lift. I wheeled him out to the car and we drove across the waking city, and he watched the streets go by with the calm of a man who has decided to trust the driver. Once he said, "Where are we going, young man?" And I said, "To see the guard, grandfather." And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something he had not said in weeks, said it clearly, out of nowhere, the way a single true note will sometimes ring out of a damaged instrument. He said, "Are they still standing?" I had to look hard at the road. "Yes," I said, "they're still standing." "Good," he said. And he faced front again and folded his hands over the metals, and I drove the rest of the way with my jaw set hard, because I did not trust my voice. The forecourt had not changed. That was the strange grace of it. The whole world had rearranged itself around my grandfather and inside him, and yet there it was, exactly as I remembered from childhood, the wide gray stone, the tall black-tipped railings, the gatehouse with its arch, and the crowd already gathering 3 and 4 deep along the rope line, tourists and families and old men like the one I was wheeling, cameras up, breath steaming, everyone waiting for the slow machine of the ceremony to begin. I found us a place near the front, at the corner where the rope line met a low stone step, where a wheelchair could sit without blocking the view, and where, I judged, my grandfather would have the clearest line to the gate. I locked the brake. I crouched beside him and pointed. "There, grandfather, watch." And the first guardsman came into view. I cannot tell you why the sight of one man standing still should stop the breath in a crowd, but it does. He came to his post at the inner gate with a precision that had nothing showy in it. That was the thing. Even I could feel it, a precision that was simply the truth of how a thing is done when it has been done 10,000 times and will be done 10,000 more. Red tunic, the tall bearskin throwing its shadow down over his eyes, white gloves, the rifle held just so. He halted and turned and became absolutely still, and the stillness was louder than any noise the crowd could make. I looked at my grandfather. He was sitting forward in the chair, not slumped, not courteous, not far away, forward. His hands had come off the metals and gripped the arms of the wheelchair, and his chin had lifted, and his eyes were fixed on that motionless guardsman with an attention so total it frightened me. I had not seen him look at anything that way in months. He looked at the food they brought him as at a puzzle. He looked at me as at a kind stranger. He looked at that guardsman as at the one thing in all the world he was sure of. His lips were moving. I leaned in. He was counting. Under his breath, almost soundless, he was counting a cadence, and 2 and 3, keeping time with a drill only he could see. "Grandfather," I whispered. He didn't hear me. He was somewhere else, somewhere true. The formation began to step off. The drumbeat came up, slow and deep, and the column came on across the stone in that unhurried, inevitable way, and the crowd's chatter died down to nothing without anyone deciding it should. My grandfather's foot was tapping. I looked down and his polished shoe was moving, just the toe of it, in perfect time. A man who could not remember my name, who could not remember to finish standing up from a chair, was keeping the beat of a march that had gone into his bones 70 years before any of this had begun to take him from me. And then it went wrong. I should have foreseen it. The doctor had warned me of exactly this. That intensity, that flood of stimulation, can tip a fragile mind from joy into terror in a heartbeat. The drums, the crowd pressing, the sudden enormous nearness of a thing his deep self knew and his surface self had lost, it was too much. His counting stopped. His hands began to shake on the arms of the chair. His face, which had been so beautifully alive, crumpled into the frown I dreaded most, the searching frown, the I have somewhere to be frown. "I have to," he said. "I have to get up. I have to." He was trying to rise. The brake held the chair, but he was trying to lever himself out of it, his thin arms trembling with the effort, his voice climbing. "I have to get to my post. Where is my, I'm late for my post, let me." Heads turned. The people nearest us shifted, the way crowds shift away from distress. "Grandfather, it's all right, it's all right." I had my hands on his shoulders, trying to be gentle, trying not to push him down like all the others pushed him down, and hating myself because that was exactly what I was doing. "You don't have to go anywhere. You're here. You're with me." "I don't know you," he said. And he said it not cruelly but in pure rising panic, a drowning man's words. "I don't know you, I don't know where I am. Where is my post? I have to stand my—" His voice cracked. People were staring now. Somewhere a child asked its mother what was wrong with the old man. I felt the whole bright morning curdling into the thing I had feared, and worse, into the thing the doctor had gently predicted, and I thought, I have done this. I dragged him here. I took a stranger out of his quiet room and broke him open in front of 300 people for my own need to say goodbye to a man who is already gone. I was reaching for the brake to wheel him away, my eyes stinging, ready to flee. And that is when one of the guardsmen broke ranks. I did not see, at first, what made him do it. I have asked myself 100 times since how he knew. The formation was a good 30 paces off. The drums were going. The crowd was a wall of color and noise between us, and my grandfather was one frightened old man in a wheelchair among hundreds of faces. There was no reason a man at his post, eyes locked forward, drilled past all distraction, should have seen us at all. But one of them had. He was at the near end of the column, a younger man, I thought, though it was hard to say under the bearskin's shadow, broad through the shoulders, his bearing exact. And as the formation came level with our corner of the rope line, he did something I had never seen any of those men do in all my life of watching them. He turned his head, just slightly, just enough. And he looked not at the crowd, not through it the way they always look through it, but at one specific old man whose thin arms were shaking against the arms of a wheelchair, whose mouth was forming the word post over, and over like a prayer he had lost the rest of. I saw the guardsman's eyes drop to the medals on my grandfather's coat, the small bright bar I had cleaned and mounted in the dark before dawn. I saw him read them. It took less than a second, the way a man reads a word he has known all his life, and I saw something move in his face that no drill in the world had ever taught him to hide. Then he stepped out of the line. It went through the crowd like a current. A guardsman does not leave the formation. It is the one thing they do not do, the unbreakable thing, the whole point of them. A murmur ran along the rope as people who did not know what they were seeing nonetheless knew they were seeing something that did not happen. Somewhere an official voice started to say something and stopped. The drums went on. The rest of the column went on, closing the gap where he had been, because that too is the discipline. The line does not falter for one man's choice. But that one man came toward us. He came at the slow ceremonial pace, unhurried, his rifle brought up across his body, and the crowd parted for him without being asked, falling back from the rope, and my grandfather went silent. The panic drained out of his face. He stopped trying to rise. He sat very still in his chair and watched the guardsman come, and I watched my grandfather, and I did not breathe. The guardsman halted in front of the wheelchair, closer than protocol could ever have allowed. He stood for a moment looking down at the old man in the good coat with the cleaned medals, and the old man looked up at him, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with names or memory, or the long gray machinery of the disease that was taking my grandfather away from me one Tuesday at a time. The guardsman came to attention. I have tried many times to describe what he did next to people who were not there, and I always fail because the words make it sound smaller than it was. He executed his rifle to the present. He brought it up in that sharp, clean, impossible sequence, the white glove flashing, the whole motion crisp as a struck note. And then he held it there, presenting arms, the highest salute those men give, the one reserved for the sovereign, for the fallen, for the colors themselves. He gave it to my grandfather. A guardsman, in the middle of the ceremony, in front of 300 strangers and the gate he was sworn to keep, presented arms to a frightened old man in a wheelchair who could not remember his own name. And my grandfather stood up. I want you to understand what that means. My grandfather had not stood unaided in 4 months. He could not rise from a chair without forgetting halfway why he had risen. The staff lifted him. The physiotherapist braced him. The disease had taken the standing along with everything else, had sat him down for good, a man surrendering a city. The medals were still on his coat. The brake was still locked. And when that white glove came up in the present, something in my grandfather that was older and deeper than the disease, older than his own name, older than me, older than the woman in the photograph he no longer knew, something in him answered. He put his shaking hands on the arms of the chair, and he pushed, and he rose. He rose all the way, his back straightening vertebra by vertebra into a line I had not seen in years, the soldier's line, the line he had meant when he said I stood my post. And he stood there in front of the saluting guardsman on his own 2 feet, swaying just slightly. And he brought his own right hand up to the brim of a cap he was not wearing, fingers flat, thumb tucked, the angle exact. 70 years of muscle finding the one shape it had never been allowed to forget. He returned the salute. I heard, behind me, a sound go through the crowd. It was not a cheer. A cheer would have been wrong, and somehow they all knew it. It was the sound a great many people make when they breathe in at the same instant and forget to breathe out. A few cameras came up and then, I saw, came back down, because even the people filming felt that this was not a thing to be filmed but a thing to be witnessed. My grandfather held the salute. The guardsman held the present. The 2 of them stood there, the young man at the height of his strength and the old one at the far frayed end of his, joined by a gesture that needed no name, that had survived in my grandfather's bones the way Sister Pell had said the deepest things survive. When everything else is gone, the standing stays longest. And then my grandfather spoke. In a voice I had not heard in months, clear, level, the voice of a man reporting to a man, the parade ground voice that had once made a 9-year-old boy sit up straight at the dinner table. My grandfather said, "Corporal Edmund Crane, reporting for duty, sir." His own name. He had not known his own name in 11 weeks. He had looked at his own reflection and asked who the old man was. And there, on his feet, returning a salute he had not given in half a century, my grandfather remembered exactly who he was. I made a sound I am not proud of and not ashamed of either. I had not known a person could feel a thing that large and not break apart from it. The guardsman did not lower his rifle. He held the present a moment longer and then, "And I will carry this to my own grave," he spoke, quietly, just for the 2 of them, though I was close enough to hear, and I am glad past all telling that I was. He said, "Welcome back, Corporal." My grandfather's hand came down from the salute, slowly, correctly, the way it should, not dropped but lowered. And he stood there a moment more, swaying, and then his legs began to go, the strength that had answered the salute spending itself all at once, and I lunged to catch him, but the guardsman was faster. He shouldered his rifle in one motion and caught my grandfather under the arm, easing him down into the chair with a gentleness that did not fit his size or his uniform or anything I thought I knew about those men. He went down on one knee on the cold stone, in his red tunic, in front of the whole forecourt, and he stayed there with one white glove on my grandfather's shoulder, while the old man caught his breath. "Easy, Corporal," he said, "at ease. You're relieved you stood your post." He said it the way you say the right words to a man who needs exactly those words and no others. "You stood it. You can stand down now." And my grandfather, settling back into the chair, looked at him with eyes that were, for that one shining stretch of minutes, completely clear. "Long time," he said, "since anyone called me corporal." "It's still your rank, sir," the guardsman said. "Rank doesn't expire." "Neither does the post." He glanced down at the medals on the old man's coat, and then up at the old man's face, and there was something in his look that was almost grief and almost joy, and was, I think now, simply respect, the real thing, the rare thing, the thing my grandfather had spent his whole life trying to teach me the shape of. "You held a line I'll never have to hold, Corporal. We know what these are." He touched, very lightly, the edge of the metal bar. "We're taught what these are." I knew the second I saw them. That was how he had known. Not magic, not luck. The thing I had done in the dark before dawn, the gesture I had told myself was only for me. I had pinned my grandfather's truth to his chest where a trained eye could read it, and a trained eye had read it, across 30 paces and through a wall of strangers, and had understood in a single second that the frightened old man losing himself in a wheelchair was not a stranger to be looked through, but a brother to be honored. Sister Pell had said, "You might be surprised what's still in there if the right thing knocked." The salute had knocked, and my grandfather had answered the door. A sergeant had come up by then, an older man, gray at the temples under his own bearskin, who I expected to be furious, who I expected to haul the kneeling guardsman back into line and apologize to the crowd and end the whole impossible moment. He did not. He came and stood over the two of them, and he looked down at my grandfather's medals, and at the younger guardsman on one knee, and his jaw worked once, and then he did the last thing I expected. He came to attention, and he saluted my grandfather too. "On behalf of the regiment, Corporal Crane," the sergeant said, and his voice was not quite steady, and he did not care that it was not. "It is an honor to have you at the gate." Then he looked at the kneeling guardsman, and something passed between the two soldiers, some understanding in the language they spoke, and I did not, and the sergeant said, "Lo, finish your courtesy, hail. Then fall in. I'll square it with the captain." And he turned and walked back to the formation with his back very straight, and not one word of reprimand was ever spoken, then or after, about a guardsman who left his post. Because some posts, it turns out, you leave precisely in order to keep. The guardsman, Hale, the sergeant had called him, got to his feet. He squared himself in front of the wheelchair one more time. My grandfather looked up at him, and the clear, bright moment was already beginning to thin at its edges. I could see it going, the train pulling out from the platform again. But it had not gone yet. "You're a credit to the post, son," my grandfather said. "All of you, tell the lads, tell them an old man said so." "I'll tell them, Corporal." "Good," said my grandfather. And he raised his hand one last time. Not all the way, not the full salute, just 2 fingers to the brim of the cap he was not wearing, the small private salute, the one between men who have stood the same kind of watch, and the guardsman returned it exactly, and then he turned and marched back to the formation in that slow, inevitable pace, and the gap in the line opened to receive him and closed again, and the ceremony went on as if it had never paused. But it had paused. 300 people knew it had paused, and not one of them, in all the time I stood there gathering myself, took out a phone to film what was left. They simply stood in the cold honey light and watched the men at the gate, and I think a great many of them were seeing those men clearly for the first time, not as pageantry, not as photographs, but as my grandfather had always seen them, as a promise made in public so it cannot be taken back. A woman near me was crying without trying to hide it. An old man 2 places down had taken off his own hat. A boy of about 9, and I thought of myself, my hand swallowed in my grandfather's, my chin tipped back, was staring at the guardsman with his whole face open, learning, I hoped, the thing it had taken me 31 years to begin to learn. I crouched beside my grandfather's chair. His eyes were already going soft and far again, the clarity ebbing, but he was calm now, deeply calm, the panic gone as if it had never been. "Did you see them?" he asked me. "Did you see the lads?" "I saw them, grandfather." "They're still standing," he said with quiet wonder, as though it were the best news in the world, which I understood at last it was. "After all this time, they're still standing." "They're still standing," I told him. "They always will be." He nodded, satisfied, a man who has confirmed the one fact he needed to confirm, and he folded his hands back over his medals, and he watched the rest of the ceremony in perfect peace. He did not know my name on the drive home. He called me young man again kindly and asked once where we had been, and I told him we had been to see the guard, and he said, "Good lads," and looked out the window, and that was all. The clarity did not last. I want to be honest about that too, because I have read the kind of story where the salute cures the old soldier and he comes home whole and it is all undone. And that is not what happened, and I would not insult my grandfather by pretending it was. The disease was not beaten that morning. It does not get beaten. By the time I wheeled him back into the home, he had forgotten the forecourt entirely. And by evening Sister Pell told me he had asked her 3 times when his grandson was coming to visit, not knowing I had been with him all day. But something had changed, even so. Something the disease could not take, because it had never lived in the part of him the disease was eating. I found it out by accident 3 days later. I had brought him a cup of the tea he liked, and I set it down, and out of habit, out of the small hopeless ritual I had kept up for weeks, I said, "It's Aldous, grandfather, your grandson." And he did not look at me as at a salesman. He looked at me for a long moment, and his hand drifted up slowly, uncertainly, the way his hand did everything now, and it came to rest against his own brow. 2 fingers, flat, the angle not quite right, the strength not quite there, but unmistakable. He saluted me. I do not think he knew my name even then. I do not think the disease gave that back to him, not for keeps. But somewhere in the deep place where the standing lives, the part of him that had answered the guardsman's present arms had filed me, his grandson, under a heading the disease could not reach. Not stranger, not salesman, something nearer to comrade. Someone owed the courtesy, someone who belonged inside the line and not outside it. After that I stopped saying "It's Aldous." It was the wrong key for the wrong lock. Instead, when I came in, I would stop just inside the door and come to attention, clumsy, civilian, but I tried, and I would salute him. And every time, every single time, no matter how far the train had pulled from the platform, no matter that he had forgotten the tea and the photographs and his own reflection in the glass, my grandfather would straighten in his chair, and his chin would come up, and his hand would rise, and he would return it. The standing stayed longest. Sister Pell had been right about all of it. I went back to the forecourt the following Tuesday alone to find the guardsman. I did not know if I would be able to. They are not men you can simply ask for by name at a gate. But I waited until the ceremony was done and the formation had marched off, and I found the gray sergeant, who remembered me at once. I asked him to pass on my thanks to the young guardsman, to hail. I did not have the words I wanted. I never do. I told him only that my grandfather had stood up for the first time in 4 months, and that he had remembered his own name, and that he saluted his grandson now instead of forgetting him. The sergeant listened to all of it without expression, in the way those men have, and when I was done he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We're not supposed to break the line, sir. You know that. It's the whole of what we are." He looked off across the empty forecourt at the gate his men had kept that morning and would keep tomorrow and the morning after that, world without end. "But there's a thing they teach us under all the drill. They teach us we stand the post for the people who can't stand it anymore. The old ones. The ones who stood it first so we'd have a post worth standing." He brought his eyes back to me, and they were an old soldier's eyes, and they had seen the medals on my grandfather's coat from 30 paces just as surely as the young man had. Hale saw a corporal in trouble at the gate. There's no protocol on this earth that comes before that. He did the right thing. I'd have had words for him if he hadn't. I asked if I could thank Hale myself. "He's on the gate, sir," the sergeant said. "He'll be on the gate for 2 hours yet, still as a stone, and you may stand and watch him the whole time, and he will not give you so much as a blink, because that is his post and he is keeping it." A ghost of something crossed the hard face. "But I'll tell him you came. He'll want to know how the corporal's doing. Ask me about it himself after. First time in 9 years I've seen that one ask about anything off the drill." So I stood at the rope and watched the young guardsman keep his post, motionless, immaculate eyes forward, exactly as I had watched men like him as a boy with my hand swallowed in my grandfather's. And I understood, finally, the thing my grandfather had been trying to give me my whole life, the thing I had been too busy and too young and too sure of his permanence to take. "People think it's pageantry," he'd said. "It's a promise, made in public so it can't be taken back. The promise is not the marching. It is not the bearskins or the gloves or the slow, beautiful machinery of the drill. The promise is this, that someone will stand for you when you can no longer stand for yourself, that the line will hold, that a frightened old man who has forgotten his own name will still, if the right thing knocks, be met at the gate not as a stranger to be looked through but as a soldier to be honored, because once, long ago, before the forgetting, before any of us, he stood the line too. And the line does not forget its own. The line is the one thing that does not forget." My grandfather died the following spring. It was quiet in his sleep, in the room with the long windows, and the last clear thing the staff reported of him, Sister Pell told me, holding both my hands, was that the evening before, with no prompting and no one in the room he would have known, he had sat up in his bed and brought his hand to his brow and held it there a long moment, at attention, saluting something none of them could see. I like to think I know what he saw. I like to think the deep place where the standing lives kept its last faithful watch, and that when the train at last pulled clear of the platform, my grandfather was not a frightened man who could not find his post. I like to think he was a corporal, on his feet, reporting for duty, relieved at last by a hand in a white glove, and a voice that said the only words that ever truly mattered to him. "You stood your post. You can stand down now." At the service, I did not weep, because he had taught me a man carries the day for the people he loves if he can. But I did one thing. When it was over, when the others had gone, I stood alone at the front of that small, cold chapel, and I came to attention as best a civilian can, and I raised my hand to my brow, fingers flat, thumb tucked, the angle as exact as I could make it after a winter of practicing in his doorway. I returned the salute, the last one, the one he could no longer give. And I understood, standing there, why my grandfather had wept at the changing of the guard when I was 9 years old and could not see what there was to weep about. He was not watching young men march. He was watching the promise hold. He was watching proof, in red wool and white glove, that the line he had given his life to had not broken when he laid it down, that there were still men who would stand at the gate, and that one of them someday might look across a wall of strangers and see an old soldier in trouble and step out of the line to honor him. He had been right to trust it. They had not let him down. They are still standing. He asked me, on the last clear morning of his life, whether they were still standing, and I told him they always would be. And that was the one promise I made him that I know, beyond any forgetting, will be kept. So if you are ever in that cold forecourt in the honey-colored light and the formation steps off, and the crowd goes quiet without deciding to look at the men at the gate, look at them the way my grandfather taught me to look, too late and only just in time. They are not pageantry. They are a promise, made in public so it cannot be taken back. And somewhere down the long line of them, if you watch closely, one of them is keeping a corporal's post for a man who can stand down now. He stood his, they are standing theirs. That is the whole of it. And somehow still, it is enough to make a man sit up straighter, and to remind him that the deepest thing we ever learn is not our own name, but how to stand for one another, and to keep standing, long after the rest has gone.